Hello, everyone. My name is Raphaël Künstler. I am a department member of Toulouse University, Jean Jaurès. I would like to thank very much the organizers of this conference, Social Psychology-Based Social Ontology. My talk will be articulated in three parts. First, I will set out the framework of the question. Then I will reconstruct Paul Roth's explanatory dispensability argument against culturalism. Finally, I will present an argument against Roth's position. Framework of the question. Since my aim is not to defend a framework, but to work within it, I will limit myself to outlining its rules and questioning. The general epistemic goal of naturalized ontology is to avoid arbitrariness in ontological commitments. To reach this goal, an explicativist norm of ontological commitment is given. A new type of entity should be accepted only on condition that it is explanatory indispensable to account for already known phenomena. In this framework, ontological debates take the form of exchanges of explanatory indispensability arguments and dispensability arguments. An explanatory indispensability argument must proceed in 4 steps. Step 1, one identifies an empirical phenomenon E to be explained. Step 2, one proves that this phenomenon is inexplicable in the current ontology. Step 3, one proves that if the entity T is introduced in the current ontology, the phenomenon E becomes explicable. Step 4, one shows that there are no other alternative explanations in the case of strict indispensability, or that the explanation based on T is better than all the others in the case of modest indispensability. The conclusion is then, it is epistemically legitimate to add the entity T to our ontological repertory. Naturalized social ontology applies the explanationist approach to putative social entities. It is within this framework that I propose to interpret both Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, his review of Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, and 2 papers by Roth, The Career of Understanding and Hearts of Darkness. Goldhagen and Roth wonder whether it is legitimate to assert the existence of a social world, which I call here culture, in addition to the natural world. I will refer to the ontological position that one cannot understand human phenomena without admitting the existence of culture as culturalism, and to the opposite position as anti-culturalism. 2, Roth's explanatory indispensability argument against culturalism. I understand Goldhagen as constructing a culturalist indispensability argument and Roth as constructing an anti-culturalist dispensability argument. I will consider here only one of the phenomena that serve as a basis for this discussion, the Josefov massacre. On July 13, 1943, the men of the Third Reich Reserve Police Battalion 101 just arrived in the Lublin district, were brought to the village of Josefov in the early morning. The commander Trapp told them that what their mission would be to kill all the children, women, and invalid men in the village. According to Browning, 80 to 90% agreed to take part in the massacre. This massacre seems inexplicable by ordinary psychology and its underlying ontology. According to common sense psychology, we obey an order either because we approve of it or despite the fact that we do not approve of it or without taking a stand. The order may be morally approved. For example, where a fireman orders me to show him where the water is. Or it may be, let's say, hedonistically approved. For example, when a doctor prescribes me to eat chocolate. We obey orders that we do not approve of, or regarding which we are neutral, either because we have an interest in them, such as a manager who implements a layoff plan in exchange for a promotion, or because we are coerced to do so, such as a manager who implements a layoff plan to save his own job. It is impossible that an ordinary person could have adhered or be neutral in the face of such monstrous orders. If the men of the 101 battalion adhered to these orders, it was either because they fanatically adhered to Nazi doctrine, like the members of the Einsatzgruppen or the SS Totenkopf, or because they took sadistic pleasure in it. Now, Browning shows that these men were repulsed by the murder they were committing, that there were very few Nazi party members among them, and that most of them came from socialist or trade unionist backgrounds. These men have therefore accomplished these acts despite their moral repulsion. It seems impossible to perform such act out of interest, and even if they had been willing to do so, the orders they were given were not associated with any promise of financial or institutional reward. Nor were they threatened with punishments if they did not obey. It is further known that not one person was seriously sanctioned for not taking part in the Holocaust. We cannot therefore explain the conduct of these individuals within the framework of a non-culturalist ontology, which is based on ordinary psychology. How can Josefov massacre be scientifically explained? Two historians studying the same archives have come up with two opposite explanations. Goldhagen argues that the massacre resulted from the perpetrators' beliefs. The perpetrators believed that the Jews had two properties, that they were essentially malevolent toward the Germans and that they had supernatural powers. Goldhagen called this eliminationist anti-Semitism because, combined with rational choice theory, these beliefs prescribe the extermination of all Jews to preserve the survival of the Germans. If indeed every Jew is all-powerful and malevolent, it is impossible to live safely as long as one of them remains alive. In contrast, Christopher Browning argues that the order to massacre given by Nazi fanatics is sufficient to explain the exactions of non-fanatical men. It is therefore not necessary for him to refer to the representation that the murders formed of their victims in order to explain the Josefov massacre. Each of these two explanations interpret the same facts, but with the help of a different empirical background. Goldhagen mobilizes textual data to reconstruct the political culture inherited by the Germans of the Third Reich. Browning uses experimental results from psychology. He argues that the Josefov massacre can be understood as an instance of Milgram's experiments. This experiment plays two explanatory roles. First, it shows that an order can causally provoke obedience independently of the moral conscience of the individual. Second, it shows that individuals can obey orders that they consider monstrous, so that it is not legitimate to conclude from obedience to adherence. If the perpetrator judges the act they commit as monstrous, their moral judgment is identical to ours, and they can therefore be considered as ordinary men. Browning's ontology is reduced to that of Milgram's experiments. And Milgram's experiment can be described within an ontology of differentiated individuals whose behavior are connected by causal relationships. Correlatively, Milgram's ontology apparently has no need to refer to a culture to generate satisfactory explanations. The content of the order determines the act to be performed, but not the motivation to perform it. What motivates obedience is the representation of the author of the order. The representation that Milgram's subject make of their victim has no explanatory impact on their actions. Therefore, Browning's explanation is ontologically less costly than Goldhagen. Indeed, like Browning, Goldhagen must admit the existence of qualitatively distinct individuals linked by causal relations, since he must admit of the existence of cultural inculcation mechanisms and cannot deny that orders serve as this to trigger the action that agents otherwise wish to perform. Unlike Goldhagen, Milgram's ontology does not appear to be richer than our common sense ontology. We admit, before scientific inquiry, the existence of differentiated individuals exerting causal influences on each other, even if we may admit other kinds of influences. What Milgram shows is only that these influences are more powerful than we had initially suspected. Since the entity culture is not explanatory necessary, introducing it into our ontology would be, from the explicativist point of view, not legitimate. Let me now respond to these arguments. The purpose of this third part is to propose a response to these arguments. My argument is an indirect argument for the explanatory indispensability of culture to account for Josephov. It can be formulated as follows. First, the Josephov situation reduces to a Milgram's experiments. Second, Milgram's experiment must be explained culturally. Conclusion, the Josephov situation must be explained culturally. And the ontological conclusion, culture is a legitimate social entity. I give myself here the constraint of accepting proposition 1 and of accepting the replicability of Milgram's experiments. My goal here is to justify proposition 2. To do this, I will first show that the situation must be explained, and that it must be explained culturally. Milgram's experiment needs to be explained. By controlling the agent situation, Milgram's experiment setup highlights that the authority's order causes the subject's acts in a counterfactual sense that without the order, there would not have been any action. This causal relationship can be conceived as direct or as indirect. If the causal relation is direct, individuals have a primitive disposition to obey orders without thinking about the contents of these orders. In negative terms, the causal bifurcation takes place in the interval between the reception of the order and the decision to obey it. This implies either denying the existence of mental states or considering that they are devoid of causal force. This primitive disposition can be criticized from several points of view. Phenomenological, Milgram subjects are interviewed and give reasons for their behavior. Empirical, if submissiveness were truly an unanalyzable disposition, the same people would obey in the same way, different authorities giving different orders, and everyone would react in the same way to the same situation. Third, experimental. If there really is a disposition to obey, Milgram could have been transparent and tell people he was investigating their submission to authority. For methodological, to postulate the ultimate character of a disposition is an obscurantist use of ontology. It is not legitimate to conclude from direct unobservability to non-existence. The relation of causality is thus indirect. The authority acts causally on perceptive organs of the subject, and his perceptive organs act on his nervous system and his mind, and these act in turn on his arm and fingers. This process, which connects the emission of the orders and the realization of the act, comprises a hole in the middle. We do not know what takes place in the mind of the agent between the hearing of the order and the execution of the action. What does the comprehension of the order provoke? Why does the comprehension of the order provoke the decision to execute it? The second part of my argument for proposition 2 argues that answering this question requires to refer to a culture. Let us analyze the implicit argumentation within the experimental setting. In the advertisement he published in local Haven newspaper, Milgram announces a study on memory and learning. Now, in the culture of liberal democracies, memory enables learning, and learning is what enables people to move, to access open positions. To help learning is therefore to fight against social injustice. Second, scientific experimentation is seen as a means to acquire new knowledge and to advance humanity. This faith in science was, moreover, much more pronounced in the post-war year than today. Every subject of Milgram can therefore the experimental reasoning that inflicting shocks on the students will help to improve the American society. This implicit argument is recalled when the experimenter responds to the reluctant subjects. The experiment requires that you continue. Within the general context set by Milgram's advertisements, as well as by the experimenter's preliminary presentation, each person understands that if he stops obeying, he puts the common good at risk. In his analysis of his experiment, Milgram acknowledged this contextual argumentation. For instance, he writes, if the experiment were carried in a culture very different from our own, say among Trobriander, it would be necessary to find the functional equivalent of science in order to obtain psychologically comparable results. Let me conclude. I have tried to show that here that Browning's reduction of the Josefov situation to a Milgram situation does not justify, from the point of view of a naturalized social ontology, the elimination of the social entity culture. On the contrary, the indirect indispensability argument I have developed shows that this social entity is present in Josefov. And if it was present in Josefov, that is enough to establish its existence in the universe. Nevertheless, I must limit the scope of my arguments. If it were possible to explain Milgram's results without postulating the existence of a culture in Goldhagen's sense, and in an ontologically parsimonious way, the discussion should be further pursued. It seems to me possible to develop such an alternative interpretation within the framework of the theory of culture developed by Skinner in Science and Human Behavior. Even if it were possible, it seems to me to have shown that the reduction of Josefov's situation to Milgram's is not sufficient to justify the rejection of culturalism. Thank you.